Good evening. I'm Alexi Lauschkin.
And I'm Girton-Mitchell. We're really happy to be on Facebook Live with you tonight.
We definitely are. We know it's a minute before 8 o'clock, so we're going to give folks just 30 or 40 seconds to get on as we get started this evening.
Right. We've been looking forward to this dialogue on breaking the silence on racism, just to demonstrate that there are more than one way that people can get involved and add their voices to a very critical issue that's facing our country now.
Absolutely. I think one of the things that motivated us is that I believe in that we had both run into a number of people who they would see things that are happening on the television, or they would see things that have been happening for the last 2 years, and they didn't necessarily feel like they could go anywhere in particular, especially in the church. There often wasn't a place for them to discuss this in the church. So we want to kind of model what a discussion might look like and introduce MLK Bridges, which is a unique partnership between Grace and Race Ministries, Inc. and Kingdom Mission Society.
Absolutely. And we find that even in our workplaces, people are looking for just basic skills to deal with some of the, if you will, traumas that happen every day. And we take our whole selves into our workplaces, and we often to be able to find, even there, a safe place, even if it is an uncomfortable place, to say what's going on in our lives and how the issues of the day are impacting us. And knowing that we can do that makes us more efficient and effective in being able to do our jobs without feeling like the rest of us is being ignored by the people we're working with.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. Having a safe place in the work environment, in the family environment, in the church environment is incredibly important. Well, we're just getting started with our conversation. Welcome to Facebook Live. I'm Alexi Lauschkin. This is Reverend Brenda Girton-Mitchell.
Good evening.
And we're so happy you're joining us. If at any point as we're talking, we're going to talk a little bit about our background in MLK Bridges, you want to ask a question, please go ahead and write your question out, or if you have a comment, we'd love for you to interact with us. It's just Brenda and I here this evening, so we will pause a few times during this hour-long discussion to try to address any questions or comments that come up. But we're so glad that you're joining us, and we're very excited to be announcing our joint initiative around MLK Bridges. We want to tell you a little bit about our story and how we came to this conversation, and so I wanted to start with Brenda. For folks who are tuning in, what is your background and how did you feel God called you to this work?
This is always an interesting question for me because I keep asking God, not only how, but why did he call me to this work, but I'm convinced that he's assigned this ministry to me. And so in 2008, I couldn't sleep. I was just having this constant concern that there was so much going on in our community that had racial undertones. And yet I didn't feel like people were being honest and open or even felt comfortable enough to call race race. I started using the expression, race is not a four-letter word, meaning that it's not a vulgar word, it's not a bad word, it's not an obscene word. So we should be able to talk about race when we're given the skills, when we're given some shared language, have healthy, wholesome dialogues about race and how it impacts our communities and our daily lives without people being in knots about it. And then I realized that many of us, if not all of us, have moments when we feel like we're not equipped to talk about it, regardless of what our racial definition is. Then we have people who are already entrenched in a point of view. Well, race is just a social construct, so I'm not going to talk about race. And on the other hand, if race is impacting how you construct your life every day, somebody needs to be talking about it.
Yeah.
And so what I felt led to do was to try to create a safe space, uncomfortable perhaps, but safe space for people to come together, discuss events of the day. We used movies, we used books. We formed ourselves as Grace and Race Ministries Incorporated, non-for-profit organization, June of 2008. And we began to host these conversations, create a place where people could come together. Not trying to build a church, But God did tell me it was a ministry. It was a way to serve his people and help us to connect with one another, realizing that he's called us to be his ambassadors, that Christ says that we're all one in him. And so how do we live that out? And that began to be the thing that just stayed on my heart and mind. How do we live it out? And if we don't know how to work in this space, how do we become better equipped to do it? And we had to work with one another. It couldn't just be people, white people or black people. It needed to be all of us in a concerted, intentional effort together to work in this space. And then I was driven by one of Dr. King's quotes, where he talks about in the Birmingham jail letter that it's more upsetting sometimes to see the appalling silence of our friends, the people we think are on the side of right, the people who we believe understands what it means to treat each other as equals. They were silent in the time that Dr. King thought he needed them most. And I found myself feeling convicted, being guilty of not speaking up at times when I knew that there was a racial issue that I could have probably shed some light on, but I didn't feel like I had enough strength, enough power, enough authority. So those convictions drove me to say, I've got to do more than talk about it and have nightmares. I needed to get active in the cause of helping to advance racial understanding. How about you? What got you going?
Well, there's a lot of stories you can tell when you have a passion for racial reconciliation, racial understanding, racial justice. The one that's coming to mind right now is growing up in Southern California, near Pasadena in Monrovia, California. And we had a fairly diverse town. Our high school was about a third Caucasian, a third African American, and a third Hispanic. And the churches, though, were fairly segregated on a Sunday. And I think even as a young boy, that made an impression on me. It made an impression on me going to First Presbyterian Church in Monrovia. Sometimes they would do a black choir visitation, and I always found it very moving. But I didn't quite understand why did we have racially specific churches. That seemed odd to me. It seemed a little different. I think as I started my professional work, as an intern with the National Association of Evangelicals, this question of how do different racial groups approach politics and approach culture was very much on my mind. And I think as I felt this call on reconciliation and Christian unity, in my own experiences, I would find that I could get along quite well with African American ministers and people of different backgrounds, but that didn't necessarily translate to other people. There were barriers, there were limitations. Some of them were based out of culture. Some of them were based out of misunderstandings, different approaches, different priorities. But I still felt like there was more work to be done. And I think the last several years, as a millennial growing up on the coast, I had thought that we were a little further along as a country on race than it seems like we are. And I'm a Christian, I'm a evangelical, I'm a conservative, and so for me, I don't, there are many factors on what's going on today. Some of them have to do with our politics, but a lot of it, from what I can tell, has to do with our culture. Our culture, where there are a lot of racial attitudes that are still really latent in the culture. And I think people in my generation who are millennial can relate to having a grandparent or a parent say some fairly racist things. I don't know if there's any other way to say it. They won't say it publicly. They're not saying it maybe all the time at work, but the racial heritage and attitude is still very much there. I'll give one example and maybe move to some of the dialogue. Talking to what's known as the greatest generation, people who served in the armed forces. And if you go back and look at that history, it's still a fairly segregated history in terms of who served and how did they serve. But I can remember as a young person going to a family and the person talking about how important it was that we interned the Japanese. and how significant that was, because they were people that would be traitorous. And it shocked me when I first came across it. But I think it wasn't something that you would have ever heard the person say very publicly. They weren't going to go around saying that on a Sunday. But in the living room of a home, you were going to hear some pretty strong racial attitudes. And I think as a culture, as part of why I like what we're calling our dialogue tonight, but also our Bridges work, there's a need to break the silence. There's a need to come out and say, there is something that occurs in the corners of our homes, maybe not your particular home, but in family homes, that actually make racial understanding much harder. And as a country, while we have a beautiful history about the dignity of the person, we also have a very hard history when it comes to how we've practically related to people of color. And it's an exclusionary history. And it's a history that we still live with in terms of policy. And unless we can start talking about both, that talking about this is within the Christian spirit, is within the American cultural spirit, I think that's what really drew me as being very interested in our partnership and some of the discussions we would have. And Dr. King I've always loved, so there's so many things I can pull from him, but lately I've been thinking about the last sermon he gave before his death at the National Cathedral. And the power of his, I don't know if there's a specific verse, but the power of his rhetoric and the need to build bridges. He had a hope for America, but he didn't mind telling America's actual story in all of that story. I think for me that ends up being a bit of a model of what we could do as churches of different backgrounds. I don't think the Lord calls us to be the same, but he does call us to love each other. And that I want to be part of a generation that says, yes, let's do this better than what we've seen happen.
And I certainly appreciate the response that you made. I believe it was one of our board members who connected us, and
that's right.
We started coming to some of the Grace and Grace events. This last fall in September, we hosted what we call Collaborative Bridge Builders, in an attempt to say to folks, we know there is good work going on in this space. There are lots of people of goodwill who want to deal with issues of race in America. We don't always know who one another are. We don't always celebrate or embrace each other's events, support each other, pull each other together. So we started thinking about ways to be collaborative, not trying to take over anybody else's agenda. The agenda is big enough: interrupting, disrupting, and ending racism in America. But to be a place where people could come together around their work and show that they were not alone, and perhaps then find some larger ways that we could work together and build out a way that people could join in the work. And so Alexi was one of the first people who came to us and said, I have an idea. I don't know what the idea is yet, and he and I met over coffee a couple of times. And because this is the 50th anniversary of the assassination of Dr. King, we thought that it would be fitting to do something honoring his legacy, celebrating those people and organizations, particularly institutions of faith, that are doing something in the space to remember his legacy and be a part of it. Hence the name MLK 50 Bridges. Now, our first goal is to get 50 institutions, faith-based organizations, nonprofits, who want to share what they're doing and perhaps then do some things together over the course of 2018 and beyond. But I wanted to ask, Alexi, what made you respond to Lindsay's request? How did the invitation to say, come into this room full of Black people, how did that land in your heart and spirit to do so?
Well, in the evangelical and Pentecostal world, and as a ministry that tries to work with both evangelicals and Pentecostals and to try to talk about the unique similarities but also differences in that space, there is a fairly robust and ongoing discussion around racial justice and racial understanding. There are younger leaders and older leaders. John Perkins is a fairly famous one in the evangelical world in terms of his work and his writing. And for me, I'm an observer So I like to listen. I like to hear. I have many different friends who are doing tremendous work when it comes to racial justice and racial understanding. But I have always wanted to see, could we find a partnership in Kingdom Mission Society where it would be very easy to start this conversation in some of the more conservative white churches, especially because there's openness in those churches to having a discussion, but they may not be where everyone else is on policy questions. And so I was looking to build a friendship with someone where we could build a fairly unique partnership. And I think dynamics in conservative evangelical white and conservative Pentecostal white churches are not that different than some of the conservative Roman Catholic churches. And so I thought, as we're developing these relationships, having a place where we could draw out some of the shyness that is in all three of those communities would be very important. And so coming to your events, I could see, oh, okay, this is a deep and serious conversation that is really as universal. We could take it anywhere. We could be at Virginia Theological Seminary. We could be at Princeton. We could be at Fuller Theological, or Gordon Conwell, and we would do just fine. And so I was looking for some transcendent spirit, and I think in Grace and Race I found a transcendent spirit. There's, like I said, a lot of tremendous work that's being done, but a lot of the work is focused so that it can organize a segment of the church. And my passion is that we don't leave out important segments that should be in the conversation, kind of sit back. Or sometimes when they are in the conversation, they try to dominate it. And I didn't think that would be very helpful to replicate that.
Well, I've had people say to me, well, don't talk to me about racial reconciliation. People of color primarily say that to me. And I understand where they're coming from, but I also know that in some instances when we're talking to people who've not engaged in these conversations, we have to have a kind of a racism 101. We got to meet people where they are. We have to share our language so that we're not off-putting before people even understand the larger platform of the issue. And it comes as a surprise to many of us that we don't know our history. And so if we don't know our history, then we don't understand a lot of the underpinnings of why people have the cultural attitudes or the sensitivities that they have. I'm a natural peacemaker. It's in my DNA. It's what my mama and my grandmama taught me to do. And so I don't have to always agree with you to be able to be decent in a conversation with you. Right. But people also know, after they know me more than a minute, not to take my kindness for weakness. I am going to say what I think God wants me to say and do. I'm going to be respectful, and I just ask people to be the same. And so in our training opportunities, we want people to learn how to be good listeners, to ask the hard questions, to be willing to be comfortable with the discomfort. When people start to share their stories, to know that those stories, as people get personal, we say, well, what happens in here stays in here. And that's not always the case, because sometimes the result of what happens there is the testimony, without sharing name, identity, and social security number. But somebody came into this conversation not knowing that their language was hurting somebody else. Or somebody came in this conversation thinking that Jesus said that everybody was white, or that Jesus said that everybody was this, that, or the other, or that Jesus shouldn't be saying anything about this, that the separation of church and state says that we're not even supposed to talk about the issues of the day. And that is not the truth. And so in the most thoughtful, compassionate, and hence the word grace, graceful way we know how, we try to take some of those tough questions and with the spirit of God's grace, living in grace, work together. Not saying that we have all the answers, but we have the heart for the work. And like you, I have a real passion for helping to bring people together. And I think that's been a point of connection between us.
It has. Well, one question I know for some folks watching, it would probably come as a surprise at reconciliation. It's not a surprise to me, but it's not that this being our first discussion, that reconciliation sometimes is a problem. Can you help explain that for folks who may be watching who haven't heard that before?
So there are many people who I've talked with who've been at our sessions. We, especially people of color, we don't have anything to reconcile. We didn't break anything. It's not broken between us. It's the white man, allow me to use that expression just for this moment, that needs to reconcile to us. We need reparations. We need them to apologize for the harm that they did to us as a race of people. And that can stop the conversation in its tracks if you haven't stopped or don't stop and do a little historical analysis. But you know, God told me to stop arguing with people about that. When I think about reconciliation in the work that I've been called to do, I'm trying to stay reconciled to God. I'm trying to have the 2 Corinthians spirit, if you will. We're broken and separated from Him when we sin against each other. So whichever word, when people talk about the social construct, I don't get stuck there. Because we can't move people from their belief system, at least fast. Sometimes they'll be transformed by renewing their mind, but that's a process. But coming to an understanding of what shared terms we will use, and hence is why you will hear us in this conversation talk more about racial understanding. And if you're at a different level on this and you're ready to move to reconciliation, or you're a different level and you say, I never want to talk about reconciliation, we want to meet you wherever you are, allow you to share your own truth, your own experiences, and still be able to move forward in grace based on your faith to help people understand and work together better, to help our churches have a voice in this space beyond Sunday morning or Saturday or whatever your worship, your group of worship meets, but to give some personal responsibility, to be intentional about learning more about the racial dynamics in this country and how we can be a voice for righteousness and grace and faith and give hope to generations yet unborn.
So just to repeat it, so you're saying that the reconciliation word, it implies mutual responsibility. And some would say, well, the group that harmed has responsibility, more primarily.
I've shifted in my thinking
Sure.
who the partners are for reconciliation. Yeah. For me, the reconciliation is with me and God. Yes. I sin against Him if I hate my brother.
Absolutely.
Regardless of what the cultural makeup is. So for me, I've gone to that place. I'm not asking the white person, if you will, to be reconciled with me. I'm saying, Brenda, be reconciled to God by being open to all of humanity, respecting everybody that God has given life to.
Right. And
I don't really have to worry about that if I'm trying to do unto others to everybody that God puts in my path.
Right.
So there are not a lot of people who are there with me, but that's where I am right now. The brokenness would be between me and God.
Yes.
If I'm not respecting you as another human being.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And that's helpful. That's not something that's commonly talked about in evangelical and Pentecostal settings, even in those conversations among diverse partners. It's not said that it's controversial at times to talk about reconciliation, but to me, as I've heard that, it makes sense because reconciliation implies that at some point two things were together. That there was a time in American history where we had equitable people going to the same church, and that isn't necessarily our history.
That's right.
There's never been a point where there was a reconciled body in this country, and so understanding, healing, a sense of who God wants us to be as a people is in a lot of ways more appropriate. Reconciliation can make sense when we were once the same and then we're separated, as has been in the case between Protestants and Catholics. They were, the white churches were part of the same church.
Wonderful example.
Yeah.
Yes.
But that's not the history of the Black church in America or our culture.
And that's exactly the tension that occurs there. But that tension shouldn't be so deep that it prevents moving forward.
Absolutely.
So that's why I like to just try to take the head on and say, okay, let's move on and see what we can do.
Absolutely.
Standing and living in grace
Right.
to address issues of grace based on our
based
on our faith.
I'm going
to
read them real quick. So if you see me go to the screen, I'm just going to see if we have some questions here. Okay. Joined. So a lot of folks just commenting that they're happy to be on. And then there was one comment that just, your shift, being really moved by the fact that you had shifted that place of reconciliation with God. I believe that's what that comment is referring to. But feel free as we're going through this, and you have questions, or if you want us to pause at a point, we'll do that again 2 more times before we wrap up.
Well, let's tell them about MLK 50 Bridges.
Yes, I'm excited.
Okay?
Yeah, that sounds great. So we have a vision. You can go to mlkbridges.com, and you can also go to our sites. I believe we have links there as well. And we want to do events in, really, if you're watching, any part of the country is fine. We're focused on the DC region in some part, but we think that's applicable to the entire church.
Yes.
And there are different types of events. We have evening events around film and dialogue. We have one-day trainings and even weekend trainings that you can participate. We're quickly growing to about 15 partners. We want to get all the way to that 50. But you can go to mlkbridges.com and you can see how you can sign up. And we want it to be a sharing space because we know we're not the only people doing work in this area. And so we want to support faith-based efforts in this area and want to make it a place where it's really a hub. We know there are some big events happening throughout the year, around April 3rd and 4th in particular in Washington, D.C., and there's going to be a rally on that date. And we know that there are different times throughout the year that work well for the church, and we already have some of our first events lining up. There's some different, we've heard people want to talk about race and education. We've heard people want to talk about race and voting rights. Yes, we've heard people wanting to talk about race and how it's applied in terms of the criminal justice system. We've also heard people just want to talk about some of the biblical basis and the historical basis and want to dive into what can I do.
Right, and we will be as flexible as we need to be as individual groups approach us. We want to see ourselves as thought partners with you. We can be consultants with you. Again, we just want to support a larger pool of people coming together to press for disrupting racism, to create that shared space, that shared language, to talk about the importance of that language matters. Mm-hmm. When I was doing some work with some of the schools across the country, I was shocked at how many of our educators didn't necessarily feel they had the skills to interpret what was going on with many of the young people in the classroom. So you had, I will oversimplify this, but you had a lot of white teachers, many of whom had been teaching for years, who were now teaching children that didn't share their race or ethnicity. And language became a real issue, not because English wasn't the first language of the children, but because the cultural dynamics were so strong. And then in the past couple of years where we had all of these tragic deaths and shooting, the climate in the classrooms and in our churches became heavy. And sometimes people didn't know what that was about. We were working with one group, I was working with one group here that was introduced to me as a result of discussion around some books. And they said they were so shocked that the newspaper was full of blood running in the streets with young people being killed, and nothing had been said in their Sunday morning services about it. And at one point, one of them felt compelled to say something to their clergy leaders. And they're now going into 2.5 years of doing some pretty interesting work with their own congregation, using their language, doing their own work to figure out how they can become activists, if you will, in the area of improving racial understanding. So we want to be a part of sharing and encouraging that kind of work.
That's powerful. I think one of our hopes, too, is that MLK Bridges becomes a practical place where people of different backgrounds can meet, which is actually harder than it seems. So one of the reasons that this can be such a difficult conversation in the life of the church, there are not that many joint clergy associations, friendships. It's less than you would think.
Yes.
And friendship, whether you're a Roman Catholic priest or an Episcopal bishop, or you are a Assemblies of God minister, friendship is kind of the coin of the realm when you're busy and doing ministry work. And there are not many practical places for clergy to meet people outside of their zones.
Hello.
And race ends up being a fairly substantial one, even if people have fairly similar convictions or theology.
Absolutely. And I think that we are hopeful to create some of that space and opportunities for, I had someone say to me, I just don't know any white people. I had somebody else say, I don't know any black people. So I think that is a true statement for many of us. So if that's the case, we want to be your go-to place to know that if you come to our events, you can meet people across culture, across race. And our shared goal will be to be intentional in learning more about each other and learning more about what God calls us to do. Because uninformed people with good intentions, it's not sufficient. We have a responsibility to understand what's going on. And Martin Luther King used the statement that in his Strength of Love book, nothing in the world is more dangerous than sincere ignorance and conscientious stupidity. So we want to break through that and help each other. The promise is that if we study together, if we challenge each other, if we have accountability partners, if we practice patience, that we can do more as believers in creating that beloved community that we celebrate in the year that we remember Dr. King's legacy.
That's really, really powerful.
I see some questions.
All right, let's see what we got here. So one question or comment, our organization has a program called Know Your Neighbor that seems similar to what you're aiming at through our focuses on combating Islamophobia and other religion-based bigotry, but racism is definitely part of it. So maybe talk a little bit about other initiatives, and we have someone on who they're focused on.
And I actually attended some of the Know Your Neighbor events. I think that's a wonderful initiative. Would welcome the opportunity to talk to you more after this opportunity tonight. As Alexi said, you can reach us online, and you can reach both of us with our first name at mlkbridges.org.
Absolutely. And at Kingdom Mission Society, we do have peacemaking work as well, but we do think that when you deal with dynamics between groups, I mean, one of my inspirations personally is St. Francis of Assisi.
Yes.
Make me an instrument of your peace. And I see that in Dr. King's words as well, very focused on this. We do a Rome to Assisi pilgrimage, but part of it is I think he had this vision of the gospel of really the prayer in the Psalms, how good it is when brothers and sisters dwell in unity.
Yes.
And practically, when it comes to race, a lot of times unity looks like uniformity in the church. That, we want to be, yes, we believe in unity. If you could all become Southern Baptists, we'd be very happy. But that's not really what the Lord's calling us towards. And I think around race, it provides us a marvelous opportunity to connect with people with different perspectives, but in an open and an affectionate environment where we can learn as we go along. You can come from whatever background, and we want to be working together with you to go that extra mile. And I think that's how community gets reformed and formed in the United States in important and powerful ways.
There are two words that relationship is one of the most important words in this conversation. And authentic relationships are essential if there's going to be any change. Because people have to come into the conversation and into the work with open hearts and open minds, knowing that it's hard work. It's HARD work, but it also has to be heart work. And you have to be willing to transform your minds, make that new connection between the head and the heart in order to have lasting, sustainable, meaningful change in your lives. And as believers, we know that that's possible. It's like going to the potter's house willingly to be broken and made over again in this space of interrupting, disrupting, dismantling racism, because it's wrong to think of anybody that God created as less than. So when we call out what it means to other people, we're doing a disservice to all of humanity. And sometimes we just don't know how to wrap our heads around where we can improve. But sometimes we don't even recognize our own flaws. So these opportunities to talk and learn and share together and push each other.
Yes.
And push each other lovingly and stop people in their tracks sometimes.
Absolutely.
There's a way to do it without shaming and blaming when people intentionally are joining in the work. We know we're going to screw up sometimes.
Right.
But that's how it's the screw ups, it's the mistakes, it's the failures that we work together to improve on as we try to become this beloved community and show brotherhood and sisterhood and that agape kind of love.
Amen. So one of the things we want to model over the time we have remaining, and we'll get to another round of questions as well, is we want to give an example of what some of these dialogues and conversations can look like. And a topic that I wanted to raise and just get some feedback on that I think is a topic familiar to a lot of evangelicals and Pentecostals. What I want to do is just have you, if you don't mind, just give your honest take on the topic. Okay, we're going to go
what
there.
The topic is anybody out there. I don't know.
But so the topic is, there are a lot of evangelical Pentecostal white organizations, ministers. They don't think of themselves quite that way, but practically that's what they are. And they'll see issues or challenges. They have some sort of, they'll see that there are challenges in the inner city. And they'll often want to cold call African-American churches and say, we want to help you. Mm-hmm. And they don't end up getting very far. Mm-hmm. And I know why that's the case. Meaning I can envision why that happens. If you have a stranger contact you and they want to offer you a lot of help, but they want to kind of control the program, even as a small nonprofit, if someone would call me up and say that as a ministry, I would say, no, thank you. Who are you? Mm-hmm. But I think for a lot of, I would say at least, well-meaning to some degree, folks, why are they, walk us through, if you are on the other side of that and you have a white person who has a lot of money and they want to throw it at you, how does that come across? I mean, I know how it comes across for me, but I think it'd be helpful for people who have had that experience, but they may not understand what they're doing.
And not trying to speak for everybody, but the presumption can be sometimes that out of the personal piety, out of the selfless giving and sharing, that's what God is counting. That I've given this money, I don't have to give my heart. I don't have to believe in what I'm doing, but I can check the box to say that I did something across racial lines.
I can show the Lord my check.
I can do it. That I didn't hide my seed in the ground. I shared it with somebody. But if you didn't share your heart with somebody, if you didn't share that time, if it wasn't worth investing some of your personal energy, if it wasn't about sharing God's love, it was about, as I said a moment ago, checking the box, then you haven't built a bridge, you haven't built a relationship. That's not somebody who's going to want to come to your funeral. That's not somebody who's going to remember you beyond that. Right. And there are times that people are in such dire need for resources to support various ministries that they're doing, that they may accept that money, but they accept it knowing that it's for this limited cause, but they don't necessarily expect that to continue. I think that the time that it takes to build relationships with people who are already busy, they just aren't willing to invest that time.
Yeah.
It's somebody else's assignment. And so I respect the fact that people have to pick their own battles, but I do think that sometimes it's very patronizing. It feels condescending. It feels like, well, I'm willing to give you a handout, but I'm not giving you the hand up that goes beyond that moment.
Mm-hmm.
So if we're not building something together,
right,
then it doesn't seem like a commitment to helping to bridge the racial gap. It just feels like the handout. And I think in the body of Christ, we need more of the hand up in terms of lifting everybody up together. That
right.
goes toward equality, that goes toward racial equity, that goes toward recognizing that we're all part of God's humanity.
Right. So what I hear you saying is a lot of that can come across as not wanting to build a deeper relationship.
Yeah.
Or an equitable friendship where it's a bit of a give and take, and it can kind of be seen as, well, who are you and why did you randomly contact me? Mm-hmm. Which in a lot of cases this is what's occurring. It's not that they're being introduced, it's more of a cold call mm-hmm. or a cold visit. So I mean, I think that makes a lot of sense to me.
And if there's no trust there,
right,
that already undermines what the people are trying to do. I think sometimes there may be the best of intentions, but it's still true. It's sometimes not what you know, but who you know. And so getting somebody to even help make those introductions, creating well, yeah, he's a good guy.
Right.
They have the best of intentions. They just don't know where to start. And sometimes it's holding somebody by the hand and taking a minute to get a conversation started.
Right.
It's risk-taking.
Yeah.
But it's out of those risks and sometimes out of those failures that the greatest successes occur. And we learn from the things that we've done that don't come off quite the way we want them to. Right. We can build on those.
Right. So here's a related question I'd just love to give your take. And this probably would occur to a lot of white evangelicals or Pentecostals. How badly does our politics come across? How obvious is it on some of our? Does it come? How much does it stand out? Is it probably that's not something we're probably aware of, and that would be interesting to hear.
It makes us all guilty to even saying the word politics in this conversation.
Right.
Makes us all hesitant, I think, that we're boxing everybody in mm-hmm. with the label. When you use Absolutely. The label about yourself that you're evangelical, right. I've been in interfaith work long enough that I don't have just one brush.
Yes.
And I know you don't have just one brush when absolutely. I tell you I'm African American.
No,
Baptist.
Sure, absolutely.
But it's easy to default to, well, a conservative, evangelical white guy
yes.
is a racist.
Okay, yeah.
I mean, that would be an easy default. It's a wrong default.
Right.
But we need more people like you who are willing to stand up and help people understand that there's not a one-size-fits-all right. in any of this work. And what I love about being a believer is I've changed my attitudes about Paul. Mm-hmm. And then when I think about Paul and what an awful representation he was in the beginning of his work as we read about him in Scripture, I see where Paul ended up,
right.
I know God can do anything through anybody God chooses to do it through. So I can go evangelical on you and say, that's where the grace and the faith part comes.
Right.
We sometimes have to meet people where they are and give them a chance. And Bob Egger, who was my boss when I worked with the National Council of Churches, used to say...
And he was the president of the National Council of Churches.
And he used to say, God loves you just the way you are, but he knows you can do better. And so we keep on trying to do better and not label people right. in such a way that we shut people out immediately because we've stereotyped on many, many, many sides.
And just to unpack that a little bit, that's very helpful. But the reason I'm asking this particular question is that these are questions that come up, and I want to model that this is a safe, what we're trying to do is create a safe space where people can have the honest discussions and build understanding. So it's not just a these are all growth moments, because that's what the Lord is asking of us,
That's
to
right.
grow up into the fullness of the stature
And
of
I'm
Christ.
telling you, this is stretching. This is a stretch role for me.
Right, which is powerful. It's powerful and that's what the Lord's calling,
Yes.
the sinews, calling them to be bound together.
Yes.
And so just to follow up on a question, one of the reasons maybe for that is the impression is that the evangelical white Pentecostal, we don't have the hard conversations about race. That's the impression, right?
The impression is that you're so
ignore it.
heavenly bound that you're no earthly good. That's a quote, not mine.
So people don't see us having, when things happen, just
Yes.
to make it specific,
Yes.
when things happen like a Trayvon Martin, or when things happen like a Ferguson, we are not making a big conversation about it. And you can see that, you can say, oh, that's the media and that sort of thing, but no, we have our own religious media.
Mm-hmm.
We have institutions like Charisma and Christianity
Yes.
Today and CBN.
Some of the
And
most
TBN,
violent.
some of the
Yes.
and some of the biggest. We have
Yes.
Lifeway Research. These are not major conversations in the way that they would be if another Christian faith community had those same vibrance
Yes.
and resources. We have Christian radio, we have the music, we have the talk, and they're owned by evangelical Pentecostals. Most of them, not exclusively white, but dominated, like any business model in this culture, they're looking at an audience, and when those conversations are occurring, they're not happening in a major way, in the same way that they would be happening if we were part of a different community. Or to take it out of a racial dynamic for a moment, the United States has had a very difficult history with Roman Catholicism.
Mm-hmm.
It's not really talked about, but some of the first nativist parties, people who were saying, let's not have people from other countries, or let's not have Catholics, please. That was kind of a focal point of American history. And so if we had a anti-Catholic thing going on, what the impression would be that it would not dominate our conscience, the white evangelical Pentecostal conscience, in the same way as other topics might. And we do have a segment of our community that is very political. I mean, there's no way around that piece. But the impression is based off of what people perceive as what's being taught.
It's easy to stereotype, and it's easy to get stuck in one image.
Right.
And regardless of what the content of that is, it's still wrong if you don't
Absolutely
take the time to examine and
Right.
take time to try to help understand
What's
one another's
coming.
perspectives and what's going on.
That's very helpful, because I think what that allows someone who's from a particular background to do is, like, we often don't have the best self-impression. We don't, if someone were to sit you down and say, Alexi, tell me how you come across, I might not be able to do that. It sometimes takes other people, and for me to listen well enough to say, okay, where is that coming from? It's coming from the sense that they're not seeing a conversation take place in the same way they are seeing with other communities. And that's cross-applicable around other
And that's
issues.
the silence that you and I said.
I'm saying we need to break through.
Yeah, then we got to break that. We got to let people know that if you don't talk about it,
Right.
it's just like in your homes. If you got an issue in your family and you never talk about it, it's always there, creating some kind of tension.
Right.
And until you examine it and expose it for whatever the issue is, hey, you didn't wash the dishes, or whatever, then the problem just grows. And then the next time there's a dirty plate on the table, something explodes and you don't know what causes it. And so we have to generate these active moments where we're challenging ourselves to do better, to be better, to know that Jesus was radical. Jesus went into the most difficult places and stations. He didn't call us to sit back and wait for stuff to happen. That's why I love the word, the call of ministry, because the call gives you an assignment.
Yes.
And tells you to do something. And we can go from Genesis to Revelation and see the folks that God called and used, and what happened to those who didn't do what he asked them to do.
Right.
So if we have to get really theological about it, as you said in your opening remarks, we can do that. We can do the systemic theology with you. But the heart work is what God calls us to do. We don't have to be talking in terms that nobody else understands. Why do you feel the way you feel?
Right.
What's happened in your life that's caused you to feel stuck around this space? Maybe nothing's happened in your life and you haven't even entered into this space. But does your faith require you to do something different than you've done in light of the racial climate in our country? And without getting, quote unquote, political in the CNN kind of sense, just saying that there are racial politics, there are faith politics. I'm talking tonight about how we use the politics of faith and grace to help us overcome the politics of race and connect people together in a wholesome, healthy way.
Right.
And it takes a long time. It's not going to happen overnight. We've got to practice what we do.
Right.
And we've got to practice what we preach.
Right. And it takes a lot of listening in relational trust to build up, in account for what has been, what could happen now, and some of the hope for the future.
I have a question I want to throw to you.
Yes,
in the last few minutes.
Yes.
I've been in sessions where we've tried to address the issue of white privilege.
Uh-huh.
And I have men in those sessions who kind of go off a little bit.
Yeah.
So what does the expression white privilege say to you, and what's a better way or a way that you would recommend approaching it?
That's a great question. So let me walk through, I think, what happens to a lot of white men when they hear the word white privilege, and then I might suggest another piece or another approach that gets at the same dynamic. Because like with any language, we're trying to say something that is real.
Yes.
But we're trying to find the language that approaches that. So when a lot of men, including myself early on, when I heard the word white privilege, I would think, wait, I'm actually interested in racial reconciliation and justice, and what sort of privilege do I have? And you get very defensive. You think, well, white privilege, shoot, I wish I could use some of that white privilege on my student loans and some of that white privilege on, you feel limitation. Unless you're a person of really significant means, every person feels some limitation on what they can do. So when they hear the word white privilege, they feel like someone's telling them they're being lawless, that they haven't played by the rules, they haven't done some things that are right, and that they've essentially they've really tried to manipulate people. That's what. So
what's a different approach? And I know that could be weeks of discussion.
It could be weeks of discussion. I think that a different approach would be that our culture has attitudes that make you, I don't know the tight word, but what I would try to describe is our culture has attitudes that make you kind of free of some of the limitations that everyone else feels. Mm-hmm. Our culture, because our culture people commonly are associating either color or looks with certain types of behavior. You don't get to experience that. You're not going to go into a situation worried about if you're going to get arrested late at night based on how you're dressed. And that's not something that you self-created, but you live in a culture where you are getting some freedoms that everyone else is not enjoying. And I think you have to realize that you may not know people for whom that's true. You may not be in a relationship with people who have the experience of being profiled, but you're living in a culture where that is occurring, and it wouldn't occur to you, or people would ask you different questions.
And that's a hard lesson sometimes, because immediately the reaction is to feel like they're being blamed for something. But it's a process, it's an education process. And so as we come close to the end of our time, we could talk for hours.
We could.
But tonight we just wanted to give you a taste. We didn't practice. I don't know what he was going to ask me. We didn't know what I was going to ask him. But we've been in ongoing conversations for a few months now about just how to be ambassadors for Christ and doing work that try to help make the corner that we're in a better corner. In September, when we had our event at Colesville United Methodist Church, the author who spoke talked about holding up your corner. How do you hold up your corner? And we thought he was going to give us really ABCs. Mm-hmm. And he says, you know what? The most important work in doing this work right now is START. Mm-hmm. So use where you are and just start. Whatever God is speaking to your heart, just start. And he will equip you and surround you with people to help support you in the work. And so that's where Alexi and I have arrived. We're just trying to start and hear God's voice and be ambassadors for helping to increase racial understanding in the corner of the world that God has assigned to us. And I see looks like there may be one or two last things.
We'll check if there's any other questions.
And then you can tell them how they can stay in touch with us.
That's awesome. So a lot of so here's a great question coming up a little earlier. How do white people get involved without appearing to be saviors? Well-meaning white people often think they know what is best for people of color. I think you are addressing this now with the hand out versus the hand up discussion. That's very helpful. If you can start, I'm happy to. Okay. So I think for the evangelical and Pentecostal, but certainly for any, I think, person of background, one tendency in white evangelical culture is to be kind of entrepreneurial, to come in and we're going to preach the good news and that's going to save people and all will be well. And the person preaching that good news is usually me. So the difficulty is this is not the sort of scenario you're going into. You're going into a place where you want to come across in equitable friendship and being willing to listen. And I think the prayer that has helped me, I don't know how to, for every white person it would help, but for me what's really helped is, Lord, I don't know necessarily what you want me, I know you're going with me, help me not to embarrass you today in my behavior. And if I can have that attitude, that generally keeps me on the more
that would be a good verse for all of us. Lord, help me not to embarrass you today. And as our time rushes to a close now, I would just like to end my remarks by saying this is not the end of anything, and it's not the only answer to anything, but this is our investment as Alexi Lotsman and Brenda Girton-Mitchell, Grace and Race and Kingdom Mission Society, to just say there are people of goodwill who want to learn how to live together in peace and harmony, to promote hope for yet unborn, and to remember Dr. King's assignment to us, that our lives begin and end the day that we become silent about things that matter. And we found that this matters so much to us that we're not going to be silent. We invite your voices to join in with us. Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. So we hope you will see us as ambassadors of light and as a space of opportunity to work together, especially through 2018 as we celebrate the memory of Dr. King's work.
The only other thing I would add to that is I really do see reconciliation in Christian unity as going hand in hand. In the Gospel of John, we see that the night before Jesus was betrayed, which is very interesting, he's going to have a close friend give him up. He prays that we would be one. And what that means to me is the Holy Spirit intercedes in the life of the church as it relates to race, is that we don't know what the Lord really might have for us into the future. And I hope that MLK Bridges and our work together is a small bridge that inspires other works, Christian works, other works of faith that create something more wholesome and more righteous for future generations.
And that's a great goal for us to have. And so as we end tonight, we say to you, I say to you, live in grace.
Amen.
And stay in touch with us. You can send us emails, and we hope some of you will join us for future activities.
Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Good night and God bless.